Right, so I want to talk about David Bowie's 60s albums, which includes The World of David Bowie, Space Oddity, which is also called David Bowie, the David Bowie Deram anthology, which is 67-68, and the album Toy, which was recorded round about 2000, I think, but came out after Bowie's death, and it includes songs, re-recordings of songs that he did back in the 60s. Back when Ziggy Stardust was big and the Hunky Dory album was selling well, the previous albums became available, and no one really minded that they put a glam shot of Bowie on the album that became known as Space Oddity. However, the compilation of his Deram recordings, World of David Bowie on the Decca label, was regarded as a cynical rip-off, even though it was a budget release and came out well before the success. But the copy I have has a glam shot on the cover, but I don't think that was on the original World of David Bowie. People would moan about the quality of the songs on the World of David Bowie, particularly a silly song about a coat with buttons of silver. I must have heard some of that album, but I was never tempted to buy it, even at the budget price. I fairly recently bought a CD collection called Width of a Circle, which features live and studio recordings made about the time of the man who sold the world. I bought this Width of a Circle box set mostly because I wanted to get a decent version of the original single Prettiest Star, which featured Mark Bolan on lead guitar. But it also has a radio session where the band play the song Karma Man, which I thought sounded pretty good. And there is also a song cycle which features the song When I Live My Dream. It was recorded for Scottish radio and it is part of a musical theatre type piece, and it has a simple keyboard arrangement. And in this setting, When I Live My Dream really stands out. It has almost like a Disney quality to it. So the Width of a Circle box set intrigued me into buying the Deram 1966 to 1968 anthology CD, which has the whole of Bowie's first album and other tracks from that time. I found the LP of The World of David Bowie at a record fair, and listening to it on vinyl I was very taken by the songs Silly Boy Blue, Let Me Sleep Beside You and The London Boys. Also there is a song called She's Got Medals, which is a song which has that sort of Hey Joe chord change, and it tells the story of a woman who fought as a man, deserted just before her company were blown up, and lived the rest of her life as a woman once again. Despite its tragic story, it is actually a very cheery and jokey song. It is jokey in the same way that Laughing Gnome is. Laughing Gnome was a hit after Bowie had become successful and was also considered a bit of a rip-off, though it has to be said the compilation album has a demo of Space Oddity, which they turned down. People also forget that Laughing Gnome, though it was a hit in the 70s, was very much of the time it was recorded. The 60s were a time of terrible children's comedy records by the likes of Terry Scott and Charlie Drake, and these were played a lot on the radio. And also, let us not forget Yellow Submarine. Bowie's 60s songs are quite complex and they often seem to be trying to fit in too many ideas into quite a short space of time. They also seem to be trying too hard to be original, but I think I prefer this approach to a lot of his very simple post-glam songs, which rely heavily on sound textures and production. The 60s songs were obviously meticulously written in advance of being recorded, as opposed to him just putting lyrics made up on the spot on top of recorded chord progressions. The early songs sound like they should have been performed on 1960s light entertainment shows, those shows that were hosted by Cilla, Dusty, Lulu, Sandy Shaw and Cliff. I imagine that were he on those shows, he would have looked the way he does on that film they made of the early songs, which you can now see on Sky, I think it is. And I could see him being backed by the young generation dance troupe. There is also that very 60s, very trebly, highly compressed Everlasting Love type bass, which is high in the mix. And of course those rather tacky strings. But once again, to be fair to Deram, they also had Cat Stevens on their label. And the production on these 60s Bowie songs is not that dissimilar to the big hit Matthew and Son. I also have The World of Cat Stevens, which is an excellent compilation. Some of those 60s songs would have been much more listenable to a 70s audience had they only had acoustic guitars. It also famously has hints of Anthony Newley, and it all seems to aspire to the numbered Scott Walker albums, though it all falls well short of that mark. Some of the songs are lyrically a bit embarrassing, like There Is a Happy Place. And some of the songs are sad character studies, like the man-child Uncle Arthur, and the little bombardier who returned from war only to be suspected of paedophilia and was forced to leave his hometown. There is a song I am growing to really like, called We Are Hungry Men. It tells of a dystopian totalitarian future, where the fear of overpopulation means that abortion, infanticide and cannibalism are encouraged. And though I like the horns on this song, I do think that if the lines were played by Mick Ronson on lead guitar, this song would have fitted quite well on many of the glam albums, or probably best on Man Who Sold the World. There is also Hey Mr. Gravedigger, which is a monologue spoken by a child murderer who is sitting in the rain in a graveyard, and he is planning his next victim, that is the gravedigger that he is watching. I also really like the song Maids of Bond Street, and I quite like the song Love You Till Tuesday, which is probably the best known of this collection, and the song which does actually sound like it could have been a hit in 1967. I think that if Deram had known the direction Bowie was going to take, they should have included these weirder tracks on the World of David Bowie. They could even have put on the almost pointless Gospel According to Tony Day, which was the B-side of Laughing Gnome. And the World of David Bowie would have been a better album if they had used some of those songs to replace There's a Happy Place or Sell Me a Coat. As a songs person, I was so intrigued by all this material that I just had to buy the Toy album, which has become one of my favourite Bowie albums, and in turn has made me listen even more closely to the original recordings. I first heard the Space Oddity album back in the early 70s when a friend bought it along with Ziggy Stardust. I always found the Space Oddity album to be a bit weak in comparison, though I did listen to both albums, which I recorded on cassette. I don't think I ever need to hear the song Space Oddity ever again, but I have come to quite appreciate the album. The strings and the Anthony Newley impersonations are all toned down a bit and replaced by acoustic guitar and more of a rock singing voice. An Occasional Dream and Wild-Eyed Boy from Freecloud are not that dissimilar to the Deram songs, though Visconti's arrangements and orchestrations are much closer to those on the numbered Scott Walker album, but there is still plenty of that 1960s compressed bass. I particularly like Signet Committee, because I love all those theatrical songs that sound like a manic preacher and just have to peak with a bolero. I also really like Memory of a Free Festival, though I much prefer the single version, which I found on the Width of a Circle box set, which has added lead guitar and backing singers, one of whom was apparently Mark Bolan. In contrast to the Deram recordings, Bowie goes the other way and is quite rock and roll on the song Unwashed and Somewhat Slightly Dazed, which is a great title, but is essentially just Not Fade Away. The Toy album has an updated version of Conversation Piece, which is considered one of his best 60s songs and was the B-side to Space Oddity. It also has Shadow Man, which is a great song which was originally done as part of the Ziggy Stardust recording sessions. David Bowie, the 60s songs.